Well, welcome to you all to the second of our fall 2020 Kessler Conversations. My name is Bo Adams, and I am the director of Pitts Theology Library here at Emory University, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. I'm joined today by Professor Erik Heinrichs, Associate Professor of History at Winona State University, and we're here to continue our fall series of conversations focused on disease, healing, and pastoral care in the 16th and 21st centuries. As many of you know, over the past 33 years, Pitts Theology Library, in partnership with many of you, has built North America's premier collection of printed books and manuscripts related to the reforms of Martin Luther and his colleagues, as well as the responses and ensuing debates of the 16th century. This incredible collection of books and manuscripts continues to grow. Just yesterday, we participated in a German auction that brings us a few works short of 4,000 items in the collection. A number of works that no other library in North America can approach, and one which places us amongst the largest collections of Reformation materials in the world. The goal of the Kessler collection, though, has always been about more than just amassing an impressive group of books. Rather, we are interested in the impact these books have on today, on the church, the academy, and the general public. That is, we understand our role to be that of educators, and our mission is to teach from the collection. And this program, the Kessler Conversations, is a wonderful example of expanding and exploring the impact of these treasures from the 16th century. I'm excited to welcome today as our expert on this topic, Professor Erik Heinrichs, Associate Professor of History at Winona State University. Dr. Heinrichs is a historian of medieval and early modern Europe with particular interest in the history of medicine and science. I commend to you his 2018 book, Plague, Print, and the Reformation, The German Reform of Healing. In the book, which grows out of his Harvard dissertation, Professor Heinrichs uncovers and highlights new sources for understanding medicine in German-speaking territories in the 15th and 16th centuries. And he highlights the importance of trade, technology, and even salesmanship in the developments of medicine in this period. He teaches a wide range of courses at Winona State, ranging from Intro to Western Civilization to specialized seminars on topics like the Reformation. And he also teaches a general education course on the history of medicine. I love that his teaching bio online notes that he has not yet to this point attempted to recreate early modern plague cures with his students. And I promise you that if you read his work, which details such remedies like the live chicken treatment, you might understand why he's not tried them yet. Today, Professor Heinrich joins us to help us understand what disease and healing were like in the 16th century. This perspective is, in my mind, so important for those of us who look to these seminal figures who are documented in the Kessler collection. Last month, we spoke with Professor Anna Johnson about Luther's recommendations for Christian attitudes and activities during the plague. And Professor Heinrichs can help us understand the medical and cultural context for a work like that. And so, Professor Heinrichs, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, particularly as I imagine you are busy facing your own challenges and learning how to teach and do research during a worldwide pandemic.
Yes, so thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be invited to something these days.
That's great. Before we jump right in, I want to quickly outline how the conversation will proceed. I'm going to ask Professor Heinrichs a series of questions, and we'll talk for maybe 30, 35 minutes. But as we do, I want to invite any of you in the audience to submit any questions that you might have for him, particularly as they may arise during the conversation. So if you look to the right side of your screen, you will see a tab labeled Q&A. And if you type your question at the bottom of that tab, it will come to me. And then as time allows at the end, I will in turn ask those questions to Professor Heinrichs. So Erik, let me start and just ask if you can give us a brief summary of your scholarship and to give us a sense of why you think it's important for your students or for any of us modern people to understand medical history from this particular time period.
Yes, so thanks. As a history student, I was interested in the history of medicine, interested in the Reformation, and over time in classes, I began to realize how important plague epidemics were. For one medieval history class as an undergraduate, the professor recommended a set of German sources that had been microfilmed from a German library, and it turned out to be all these plague pamphlets. And he mentioned that these plague pamphlets aren't very well studied. There's a lot of potential for new perspectives to come out of them. And so let me just show you an example. I've got some slides to show. And maybe just seeing these slides seeing what one of these plague treatises looks like gives you a sense of why I fell in love with them as a student and wanted to go out and read as many as possible. So this is as you can see, German language plague print from, this one was printed in Leipzig in 1495 or thereabout. They're illustrated with rich pictures of cultural explanations about where the plague comes from, and the solutions. This one comes from 1529 by one of the more important figures that I uncovered in my work, Caspar Kegler, a doctor. And finally, this is just one other example that provides interesting changes to the illustrations. Maybe we can talk about it somewhat later. But it's, it just shows how impressive these cultural products are. And I just fell in love reading these old texts. But basically, they're written by doctors, and doctors, university-trained physicians at that time, also gave spiritual advice. And so this is how I tied this into the Reformation theme, looking at the spiritual causes, spiritual solutions that doctors talk about, became one theme, and how that changes over time. But then maybe 90% of these plague treatises are about explaining natural medicine, how to prevent the plague if it comes to your city, how to cure it if you even get sick. So I mean, the medicine is obviously very different from today. So there's a lot to question and a lot to get into about their worldview and why they thought certain recipes worked at the time. But yeah, in general, I mean, why is this important for people to understand? I think the historical reality is that epidemics killed, were the number one cause of death between the start of civilization and the 19th century. So it really is, this experience of repeated epidemics that come through your city or your town really is such an important historical reality that you can see why so many doctors were writing about it and wanting to sell their work to a broad population in the vernacular language at the time.
So I imagine, most of us, when the pandemic started here, it changed our world a bit and kind of changed the way we think about things. How did you, as a historian of plague, kind of think about the pandemic that now seems so new to us, but may not be so new to you?
Right. Yeah. It has been very interesting reading the news and seeing my research topics reflected in current events. But I would say what's similar between today and the past is the amount of fear, and the economic dislocation is, I would say, similar to what a plague epidemic would do to a city in the past. But the mortality rates are so much lower in the current situation than in the past. And so I would say that reflects well on modern medicine, being able to adapt to a new sickness that suddenly breaks out. And yeah, so maybe an early modern plague would maybe kill 10% of a city, whereas in today's situation, we're well below 1% mortality rate. I think it's some small fraction of 1% at this point, which is a wonderful thing. But so it's certainly a mixed comparison between past and present with these epidemics.
So, we mentioned this word plague, and I think someone like me thinks about the plague as if it were a discrete event that started one year and ended another year. But as I read your work, I get the sense that plague was a general threat to populations at all times. So can you give us a sense of how threatening these diseases that we generally call plague were for the general population?
Right. Yeah. So the most famous one is the Black Death of 1348, which killed, historians estimate, 1/3 of the population to up to 2/3 in some cities and locations. So yeah, that's a clear, important threat to the entire community. But a lot of people don't realize that these plagues continued. It seems like bubonic plague became endemic among the rodent population of Western Europe, and so you would get repeated outbreaks, jumping. It's basically an animal disease that jumps to humans sometimes, and so you see repeated outbreaks among human populations in Western Europe through 1720, and later. In Eastern Europe. But so basically every generation would see, these occurrences were so consistent that every generation would see at least one plague come through your community, and sometimes in bad periods, 2 or 3 within your lifetime. So yeah, this is certainly something everybody dealt with, and that's not even mentioning other sicknesses that were spreading. That's strictly bubonic plague, which historians are more confident these days that it really was bubonic plague that was terrorizing Europe here since the late Middle Ages.
So, I think most of us now, you're daily reminded by masks and orders to social distance how it is that disease spreads, right? We have a good sense of how contagion works nowadays. Was that the case in the 16th century? That is, were there other theories about how a disease was spread or other ways in which one could protect him or herself?
Well, right, yeah. There are many differences between today and the past. And so, I was actually just thinking about masks and trying to remember if I saw any reference to masks in these 16th century sources. And I can't remember. There's often a lot of explanations for using hanging something good smelling around your neck, because one of the primary explanations in natural medicine is that it's bad vapors, bad smells that come from filth or come from underground, which is always believed to be a very dangerous place. These bad vapors in the air, the miasmas is what they called it, was the primary cause of plague. And so if you fumigate, you have good smelling things around you, you burned herbs inside your home to purify the air. So much medicine is focused on dealing with the air environment around people. But what was the original question? I feel like I'm forgetting.
Well, I was just curious if there were was it contagion like we think of, that's how disease gets passed, or were there other theories on that?
Right, yeah. So the air environment's the main focus for a lot of doctors, but there are also theories of contagion that are circulating in the 16th century. You've got, and over time, there's more and more emphasis on contagion into the 18th century and beyond, that this can spread person to person, or this could spread through inanimate objects. But oftentimes in their explanations, these two main theories mix. Like, people would say, avoid things that have been outside in the bad air, that have touched the bad air, can communicate that way. So there's a lot of complexity. You've got some categories, but they always seem to break down, especially in popular explanations, versus what the academic doctors were saying at the time.
Well, so I'm curious about this term doctor. If we think about getting sick or avoiding getting sick, we know who to go to, right? We have people who are credentialed and we go and get their advice, whether they're, they have certain degrees or they work in certain hospitals. In the 16th century, whom did people solicit advice from, right? Is there a clear difference between a doctor or a healer, or who was identified as the authority?
Right, yeah. So who we talk about doctors, they're university-trained physicians. They go through, I think it's overall 8 years at the university, including undergraduate. Varied, of course, here and there, but they were seen as the elite medical practitioners because they could read the ancient texts of Greek and Latin sources about what the ancients thought exactly about these sicknesses. And so oftentimes the university-trained physicians were the doctors to the ruling class. The most educated seemed to be their target audience. But really, historians estimate in regular times, it's maybe only 10% of the population would visit university-trained physicians. Most of the medical response, the natural medical response, would have been handled by apothecary shops. Even in Germany today, you can go into a pharmacy and talk to the pharmacist, and they can recommend specific things more so than in this country. Or surgeons. There's a big class of somewhat lower medical professions than the university-trained doctors. But really, maybe this is similar to today, but most of the natural medical care would come within the home. Like the parents, of course, were your first line of defense, grandparents. If they couldn't help you, you would talk to usually an old lady who lives down the street, who's seen a lot of things in her life. So most medical care is at that level. People people who are kind of equals in your social class and weren't very expensive and had a lot of practical experience, rather than there would be mistrust of these learned doctors who know more about Latin sources than actually touching people.
I wanted to talk about one particular figure you mentioned earlier, whom I know you've worked on, and this is a German physician, Caspar Kegler, who lived in Leipzig from 1461 to 1537. So he's active right in the middle of the kind of beginnings of what we call the Protestant Reformation. Can you tell me a little bit about him and why he serves as a good example for understanding kind of how medicine changed in this period?
Right. Yeah. So it's my favorite figure that I uncovered in this research, and he was actually the most he wrote the most reprinted plague pamphlets of the 16th century. But when I began to research him, I couldn't find information about him. Only the most brief info. Like, this is the guy who wrote this work in 1521 or 1529. He had two different things. So yeah, that became a giant mystery for me. Why is this guy so popular? Why don't we know anything about it? And so it turned out that I noticed unusual things in his works as I went along, especially, so he adopted alchemy, and alchemy provided a layer of secrecy around his cures. This is a time before patents. Patents only came in very, very, very much later than the 16th century. And so he seemed to be using alchemy as a way of protecting the secrecy of his special cures. But he also provided a lot of justification for his medicine from experience. This man was a learned university-trained doctor. He was actually lectured at the University of Leipzig, so he was a medical professor, I guess you could say. But yeah, he really seemed to be a master at popularizing the academic ideas of the time, talking to the regular German who would be reading a German vernacular pamphlet at that time. And so he uses more popular ideas about the body and how it works. But most importantly, he claimed to invent a new plague cure, a new plague preventative, using these tricks of alchemy and even sort of exotic cures like unicorn horn. And so promoting this in print, I began to realize that this really does seem to be the first example of a modern name brand medicine, right? He called it, his family later actually called it Dr. Caspar Kegler's Electuary, and he had a couple other ones that became famous as well, but that was the most famous. And so yeah, an electuary is like a paste-like confection. You can take it in like little pills and things like that. But it really did seem to be a more sort of modern name brand medicine. Before this, you didn't see doctors claiming to invent something new, but then people naming it after themselves or after their family. But then also utilizing, so this is the first example of utilizing the new technology for mass communication, mass advertising of this new wonderful plague cure. Right? So he really seemed to have his finger on the pulse of culture, adapting, adopting the most recent communication technology, knowing what people wanted exactly. In medicine, people want some sort of silver bullet pill, right? That's going to take care of all your problems, rather than a normal academic physician would probably tell you to change your diet and lifestyle and habits to help protect you from plague. Which is sound medical advice in any century, but yeah, he seems to have cracked the code here in the 16th century about what people want. How can I advertise this broadly? And yeah, it became a completely remarkable case that I wrote about in my book.
Well, what I find remarkable, I mean, you mentioned it earlier. You had mentioned that he sold more pamphlets than Luther's actual pamphlet about whether a Christian should flee a plague, which does point to the fact that he grabbed onto this print technology as a way of disseminating, and also that he himself was a salesman, right? And that was an important part of a doctor's life.
Right. Yeah. In this example, it is. So, but let me just say it's hard to say exactly how many copies the family sold, but it certainly went through printings, more printings or editions, as the Martin Luther Plague Sermon, which I think came out in 1527. Mm-hmm. And then also was a hugely popular work that got reprinted all around German cities. The numbers are close. I mean, up to 1607, adding everything up, it looks like Kegler is slightly ahead. So I should qualify that claim, but yeah.
Yeah, and what I found interesting too that you mentioned is in Leipzig in particular, Luther had built up this print industry by his wild popularity. And then Luther, of course, gets in trouble, and then it becomes illegal to print Luther. And then you have this excess capacity of printers who are looking for content to print.
Right. Yeah. No. So the 1520s is really a special decade when it becomes clear how important vernacular print is going to become. And Luther is probably the main figure showing the way to printers. Like, yeah, there really is an audience if you print up something exciting and something that people want to read. But so Leipzig became one of the more censored cities, though, and it actually became a capital crime to print Luther's works. I forget what year exactly that came into play, but it was after 1521 or thereafter. So, and there was even one printer executed for printing Martin Luther's works in Leipzig. So, but it seems that once this Luther ban went into effect in Leipzig, it had been such a great center of print. The printers, they're businessmen, they're looking for, to keep their business afloat. And they just turned to whatever seemed to be popular that people wanted to read. So you do see a tremendous output of these plague treatises with all sorts of pictures, coming out of Leipzig presses.
Well, and I can't help but think of the parallel to our current time, right? We've had this boom of the internet as a new medium where information can be spread widely, and then it becomes very difficult to know whom to trust and whom not to trust. So it becomes a medium for disinformation as well. And it does seem like at a lesser scale, but the print technology is the same. Everyone now has a microphone, and so people like Kegler can start to promote their cures even if there's not real evidence that they work.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, this is before modern medicine. It's before big trials, data evidence showing that these things work. Yeah, that's certainly true. It's, medicine remains the Wild West, actually, until the late 19th century. It is one of the strange characteristics of the past that you get modern science so many centuries before modern medicine. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was curious too. So you make the point that Kegler either marks or demonstrates a development in the history of medicine. And you mentioned before, it was important that your cure had antiquity, right? That it had worked for a long time. But Kegler seems to have a bit of a different argument in that he points to personal experience. Like, this has actually worked for me or for people I know. So is that a pretty big shift in the way we think about arguing for your medicine or your cure?
Right. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that back up. I meant to talk about that before, but yeah, certainly for university trained physicians, this was odd to kind of structure your to talk less about the scholarly pedigree of where your cures come from. Like, this is the great ancient theriac that the ancients trusted, and so on. But to change and say something, no, I made this and I used it all over. I was the plague doctor at the Lazaretto since blah, blah, blah. I used this on my family. I used it on myself, and it works. So that seems to be a popularization of why you should take these medicines. But yeah, so this is one theme I talk about in my work on Kegler. Is it does seem to be turning medicine more towards a practical justification, a more experience-based justification for why people should try certain cures rather than, just staying theoretical. And so, yeah, you could maybe say this is helping medicine, moving it closer to what we know modern medicine to be, although we're certainly still a long ways away.
Well, I wrote down a quote from Kegler, and I assume this is your translation. So there you go. But let me read that and just give you a response to this, because I think this is probably pretty typical of how he advertises things. So he says, quote, "Above all, these is my electuary, used early in the day on an empty stomach, 2 peas in size. A person is protected for 24 hours with the help of God. Also smear an amount the size of 2 hemp seeds in the nostrils with the fingers, pressing the nose shut. This prevents the brain from being poisoned for a day." So what do you make of that?
So, no, it's a good example of how a recipe works. It's, there's often a comment in there like saying, well, all medicine depends on God's help. If it's against God's will, then you're just not going to get better. There's that sort of explanation worked in there. But it's also, I think that quote demonstrates the practical nature of these recipes. It's like, yeah, this is really effective. Do it every day. And yeah, smearing something in your nostrils, reflects that concern with the poisoned air environment. So I think that's a good example.
Well, yeah, and I think the language "with help from God," you make a really good point. I mean, God's in control of all of this from whatever perspective, but it also protects the salesman a bit, right? If it doesn't work, then not exactly my fault.
Right, yeah, don't come back to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is in the midst of what we're interested in the Kessler collection, and that is the Protestant Reformation, right? In the works of Luther and these who are making radical changes, not only on ecclesial structures, but in culture as a whole. So how does the kind of confluence of changes in medicine and the confluence of changes in church and worship, how do those two things work together? Does the Reformation have an impact on people like Kegler?
Well, it's hard to say, hard to speak specifically to Kegler, but in my book I talk about the reform of healing in general, and in these plague treatises I see it starting with doctors. Actually, I mean, one thing I tried to emphasize is the role of physicians in the Reformation, that typically they don't get much attention in the normal narratives about what's driving the Reformation. But I mean, since plague is such an important part of life, you would imagine that this is one of the major topics that needs to be reformed. And so I talk about the doctors, how they reformed the spiritual medicine that had been presented in the late Middle Ages, which is very Catholic. And a lot of doctors become Protestant, and so they change the spiritual medicine. But then Luther comes in writing about plague in 1527, and Luther, there's a concern among Protestants that a lot of people would say, God will heal me without natural medicine. You just have to have a faith alone approach to doctors and natural medicine in general. And that was specifically preached in Wittenberg by Andreas Karlstadt. And Luther responded to that and would say it's actually more a traditional view that no, God sent natural medicine and God commands natural medicine in various parts of the Bible. So therefore, you have to do what the doctors say. You have to do what your healers say. And he even intensifies the justification, saying that it's suicide not to listen to the doctors, just like natural medicine is like food. It's like water. You take it to keep your body going, and it's a very good thing. It's divine. It contains the word of God, is what Martin Luther said. So yeah, so it's strong praise. And so in general, I talk about how there's a lot of praise of doctors, a lot of praise of natural medicine in in Protestant rhetoric after that. And so I would say it certainly helps the social authority of doctors. I mean, this is a group that it maybe only serves 10% of the population in normal times. During plagues, certainly more of the population, but they want market share. They want a reason for people to trust them. And so having these important preachers say exactly that is great for the medical professions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear that you hear a lot of that same rhetoric today, right? This idea of I will be protected by God, therefore the medicine is not necessary. It's interesting to find that that has roots at least 500 years ago. I also had not thought about the fact that a strong emphasis on slogans like faith alone could lead you in the direction of saying, well, faith alone, therefore you don't need to do anything. And we certainly learned from Anna Johnson last time when we talked about how strongly Luther responds to that and how he does say, you really have to work through the medical industry, if you will, in order to make this God's work work. I also didn't get the sense that it's good for business, like you mentioned, right? That the healers needed this emphasis.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more research done on the connection between Luther and doctors. Like, you know, in the sources I've seen so many references to doctors around Martin Luther who treat Martin Luther. Martin Luther's son becomes a doctor in Wittenberg. So there's more to say on that topic. I don't think enough has been done there.
Well, and these conversations about disease, of course, didn't happen in isolation. As we mentioned, you know, there's a Reformation going on, so there are societal changes. I mean, it reminds me of, we talk about the pandemic as just one part of 2020 being this like overwhelming crisis after crisis after crisis. Can you address how other major changes in society at this time affect this, right? I mean, there are political threats, there are rifts within Christianity at the time. So was this a really kind of chaotic time compared to other times?
It certainly does seem to be more chaotic. The 1520s especially seem to be more, have more chaotic events take place. And there was apocalyptic expectation before the Reformation and after the Reformation as well. I didn't see that come up so often in the sources, but every once in a while you would see a doctor refer to Luther as like the last prophet, or you would see even Caspar Kegler, he lived in a Catholic state, but it seems like he brings up this compounding of problems. Like you have what he calls the new unchristian faith spreading in the 1520s. So that's the rift in Christendom, Western Christendom. Then you have the Ottoman Empire threatening the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. You know, you would have a siege of Vienna in 1529. You've got the sack of Rome by imperial troops in 1527, which was another like astounding moment for a lot of people. And so he mentions all these things and then brings up, and now we're experiencing new sicknesses that we've never seen before. So that's something I didn't talk about much before, but following the Age of Exploration, or you're in the midst of the Age of Exploration in the 1520s, there's more connections around the globe. And so you do have, in general, there's more connections between regions. So you do seem to have new sicknesses that Western Europe had never seen before. They're called things like the French disease. Caspar Kegler in 1529 is reacting to the English sweating sickness. You always blame foreign peoples for the sicknesses that you get. But he understood English sweating sickness as a pestilential fever. So that one's kind of classified with plague or pestilence is the term they used here. So I mean, it's very clear to them that there's so many like compounding of all these amazing events that we haven't seen in a long time or ever. So you can sense why some people began to talk in apocalyptic terms, but it was never very common in the plague sources that I read, at least.
I suppose we can take some comfort in that our existential distress of 2020 has at least some historical forebears in the 1520s. So let's hope our decade ahead is not as fraught as perhaps some of them thought theirs was.
Right. Yeah. And in general, I thought one main message I want to convey here is that mortality rates have been so much worse in previous plagues. Certainly the suffering is real right now. But I would say history provides comfort here to show us that societies, countries have made it through even tougher challenges in the past. So eventually this will pass. We can, in the meantime, we can all suffer together like most people of the past.
Well, I want to turn and ask a very selfish library-focused question, and that is, why is what we do as libraries important, right? So what we do is collect all these ancient sources, and we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money buying up original works and holding on to them. So from your research perspective, why is that work important? And I'm hoping that you do say it is important, otherwise we've got a real problem here. But why do libraries matter in this kind of research process?
Yeah, no, certainly I would say it's important to show up in person to see the sources themselves. I had so much fun researching this after the year 2000, starting in 2005. I went to a lot of rare book rooms in southern Germany, touching the sources. One of my advisors would always say that these old sources have an aura about them, that you have an emotional reaction when you physically are holding it. And I would say it's important. I mean, you could maybe look at some of these things digitally, but it's important to get that inspiration from the emotions of holding a human artifact that's 500 years old and like looks as good as they do. I'm always astounded by how good the paper looks after 500 years. You have that emotional reaction, you get that inspiration, and that really helps power you through a long research project. It's like I spent years reading plague sources, and you have to love it if you try to survey hundreds of these plague pamphlets like I tried to do, or I did.
Well, and I mean, I think your example is a really good one. Like Kegler is a known figure, but not a well-researched figure. And it's not like there are just edited volumes of Kegler's works existent, right? You have to work with the originals. Otherwise, there is no research.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, seeing the text in person, you also notice different things you may not notice digitally, like watermarks on the paper, or maybe fingerprints, or clues that give you a sense of how these texts were used, which historians really want to know. Like, was this text just sitting on somebody's shelf? It was never used and therefore not important? Or were these texts actually used? And so, I mean, sometimes I've seen pamphlets that are in really rough shape. Looks like they've been like burned in some places. And so you could maybe say, oh, well, maybe that comes from use. I mean, maybe this was in the kitchen as someone was cooking up one of these recipes and got a little too close to the fire. But yeah, often it's hard to say. Often you look at things like annotations in the recipes, like a user would say, yeah, this one is really great, writing in pen. So that's gold for the historian, trying to show that, this is useful at the time. It's important.
Well, I can say from our library, I of course wanted to acquire one of these Kegler pamphlets before we talked, but they're near impossible to get your hands on. And I think there's only one copy in a North American library. So we'll continue the search to see if we can have a copy, but unsuccessful so far. So I want to turn, Erik, now to a couple of questions that have come up from the audience, if you don't mind just addressing those. The first, I'll read here. You often hear that local Jewish communities were sometimes blamed for outbreaks of plague, often resulting in violence against them. Were these ideas ever mentioned or supported in these physicians' publications? So generally, was blame associated with particular ethnic or religious groups?
No, I actually never saw any kind of anti-Semitism in these sources. So I think it was much stronger in the 14th century when the Black Death. That's when you see some of these more famous pogroms. But But no, I never saw academic doctors talk about it or mention it. And I even saw one pamphlet that was supposedly written by a Jewish doctor, and yeah, Moses Staffelsteiner. It was, so, I mean, that just says something that there's like an absence of that in the 16th century and 17th century.
So another question is, how serious was the plague during Luther's lifetime? How many years would an outbreak of the plague last? What percentage of the population? I mean, is it possible to kind of give a general answer on that?
Uh, yeah, I do show, because his lifespan is roughly similar to Caspar Kegler's. In my classes, I show a slide that shows all the epidemics that he experienced. I mean, it depends. The city would maybe determine the answer specifically, but there's at least 3 or 4 plagues that passed through the Holy Roman Empire at this time, and if you include the English sweating sickness of 1529. So it's, yeah, I mean, so I would say it's even sicker than normal during the, following this age of exploration. The early 16th century is even sicker than normal in the bigger context.
So we talk about now our pandemic being a kind of once in 100 year, but this was a much more frequent kind of, at least generational, one would experience something like this.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, I was even reading a plague pamphlet that was supposedly by Martin Luther's son-in-law, where he was using Martin Luther as a medical example of medical behavior, saying that Martin Luther instructed everyone in his household to do this and this and this, and holding that up as part of this like Lutheran support for natural medicine. So we know Martin Luther lived through some of these important plagues of the time.
So here's an interesting question. So how would you characterize the cultural, sociological, and spiritual changes affected by plague writ large? Or to put it another way, given your perspective on the crucible of epidemics, can you imagine how COVID might impact the modern world beyond just the lens of medicine? It's a big question there.
It's a big question. I mean, yeah, I was thinking earlier about how odd the 20th century has been, that we haven't experienced one of these plagues. And I mean, there's no living memory of one of these major events. I mean, maybe the last one was the flu epidemic of 1918. But yeah, you can find very few people who can talk about that from personal experience. So yeah, we were definitely caught off guard just because, but I think it makes people realize how different the last 100 years have been compared to the rest of history, and that, I mean, I think it will lead to a reappraisal of our own times as unusual. Just doesn't have the same tenor as most of the human past. And so yeah, I mean, modern times really are different, and so we need to appreciate that.
So I'm going to move to a more practical question. These doctors like Kegler, these university trained doctors, do we know how they charged? Were these expensive people to go and see? Were the cures expensive?
I mean, I think in regular times it would have been more expensive than a surgeon. I don't have exact figures, but that's one of the reasons why regular people wouldn't go to see a university trained doctor at this time. But during plague times, starting in the 16th century, there's more civic engagement. The civic authorities tried to do more by separating the sick out. They created lazarettos, these pest houses, to separate the sick from everyone else. There's more public health infrastructure that's being built. But one of the things that city authorities would say is, no, I mean, you can go down to the pharmacy and get, a basic level of plague preventatives for free or for very little cost for what they called the poor people. And then richer people would have to shell out some money. But so it's, it's a very kind of social vision, trying to medicate all of society, providing free care during these crisis times is maybe something our world can learn from.
Yeah. Well, that was, I mean, there was another question too about the state's interaction and how much the state authorities would have played, kind of like our government now is saying you can or can't do X, Y, or Z. So it seems that that was a role that the government did take on, is to try to enforce certain rules on people.
Right. Yeah. So there's a whole category of these plague treatises that are written by doctors who are employed by cities who are specifically trying to set up basic public health measures. And so, yeah, so that's an important step in creating this base public health infrastructure, creating rules for where you can go if you're infected, or regulating populations.
Well, there are several more questions, but I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to wrap us up here. First of all, Professor Heinrichs, thank you so much. Let me just ask.
Can I take the bird face mask one?
I'm sorry?
Really fast?
I
see one question about the bird face mask. Can I take that really fast?
Please.
Yes. So that's what my students always think of with plague medicine, is the doctor mask with the beak, right? And a lot of people think it's as old as the Black Death, like 1348. But no, I mean, the only historical evidence that comes in the 17th century. But doctors would, supposedly the first time in Rome, and you can even see one of these face masks in a German museum in Berlin. You can have a physical specimen. But yeah, the beak was supposedly there to hold good smelling things, to help vapor out the bad, freshen the bad air, the bad vapors that you would be breathing. So yeah, so face masks, I think there needs to be more work in light of current events on personal protective equipment for early modern doctors. But yeah, it's a great topic.
Maybe we should change all of our masks to have this sweet smelling stuff in the front of them now that we're all wearing them. So
it might freshen things up a bit.
Well, let me ask one quick question: is if people want to learn more, is there a resource or a book? I mean, your book, of course, and we're going to distribute a reading list. And so certainly your book, but are there other kind of general introductions if people want to learn a little bit more about this topic or this period?
Right. Yeah. So two of the very short general medical history texts I use there's one called The Very Brief, A Very Short History of Medicine from Oxford University Press by William Bynum. And the other one I like is Roy Porter, Blood and Guts is the title. Very short, readable chapters. It gives you a good overview. But I'd also like to plug this article I wrote that I think says a lot about plague medicine and how it changed. It's a history of one odd cure for buboes that I encountered. I would encounter again and again in the sources, but it basically has you using a live chicken to pull out the poisons in the bubo, in the plague bubo. And I just began to track. It was so funny. It was so odd. I began to track the evolution of this cure. And I even found roots of it back in Avicenna, a Persian doctor from around the year 1000, who wrote the Canon of Medicine. It was just so influential in the early modern and in medieval and early modern times. So yeah, so I'm going to recommend that one as well, because it's funny that they're using live chickens as medicine, but there actually may be some evidence that there's something there, like the warmth of the chicken is like a warm compress on a swelling, which might help, actually. It may not hurt.
Well, like I said, we'll distribute a reading list. So if you want, I've read the live chicken article and it is fascinating. I don't recommend we try this, but I do think it's an interesting way to understand the development. So, well, Professor Heinrichs, thank you so much. I want to thank all the audience for being here. I want to remind you that we have a third conversation upcoming, and I'll put that up here with Ronald Ritgerds, as you can see, on November 4th. I hope you'll tune in live. And this conversation, as well as our previous conversation last month with Anna Johnson, will be available online, so you can always have access to those. In the meantime, thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions and conversation, and I hope you all stay safe out there. Goodbye.